Greetings, friends. Waningriska here, and this is the weekly Russian Ukrainian War update for the week of October 14th through October 20th of 2024. And this week we actually have a lot of updates along the front, so let's get started. And this week we could talk about the start of a lot of encirclements happening. There's a lot of things that have been in motion for a little bit now that are now finally bearing fruit, and we're going to talk about them. But first, we're going to talk about one of the most interesting areas of the front that we don't really talk about much, but it's a big thing that happened, and this week the Russians have finally cut the Oskol Ukrainian defenses in half. By, how would you say this? By the capture of the village of Krutalivka here, this village right here. And we have geolocated footage of the Russians being in this village right here. And so, as you can see, the Oskol River is right here and provides a convenient defense point so that the Russians, once they reach it, could then now spread in two directions. So before, this was a continuous front line. So there was usually a lot of sources kind of split this between the Kupiansk directions, this area, and then the Liman directions, everything to the north of the Oskol River here. So kind of like this. But this was basically a continuous front. This is why when I talk about it, I kind of talk about both of them at the same time, because they are all it's kind of part of a continuous front line, and they kind of work with each other. However, with the splitting of these two fronts, the Ukrainians that are now defending Kupiansk are now cut. Now they're not officially cut off, right? So they could, the Ukrainians could still try to use, go through here and then just supply them from the back here. But again, crossing the river when the Russians have been targeting the bridges a lot, is a lot harder than just going through land. So the communication between the Kupiansk defenses and the Liman defenses are now cut. Now, the battles for this are still ongoing. The Ukrainians are trying to dislodge the Russians from these villages. A lot of sources are saying the Russians have also entered the village of Maksymilianivka here and are now battling for this village, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians took this village as well. And what the Russians are trying to do, right now the Russians are clearing Kotorlivka. They're going to take Klosanivka and Guliskovka here, and have this basically what they're trying to do as they're battling for these three villages, and right now they're trying to clear them, is basically have split this officially in two, and then the Ukrainians will fall back to better positions in the Kupiansk suburbs. Now, my theory is that I don't think the Russians will continue advancing towards Kupiansk. I mean, they will eventually, but I think their main goal, because it helps serve in conquering Donbass, is they're going to move southwards towards Borova. And I think that is one of the main goals that the Russians are going to try and do, capture the village of Borova, and then from there, continue going down, using the Oskol River as a natural defense on their left flank, and then reaching, kind of where they were in 2022, and they could outflank Slavyansk, take Liman, and what happens is that, not only does this cut the communications between both Kupiansk and Liman, is that all the Ukrainian defenses that they've been building up, here, right? They've been defending, a bit further here for 2 years now. The Russians, if they continue advancing southwards, right? So let's say they take these three villages. They probably will do this by the end of next week. But then in the following weeks, they'll push southwards. They'll probably reach Borova. So once the Battle of Borova starts, right, then, all the Ukrainians that are here, they're going to be in a big trouble because, the Russians could, attack from here. And then once they capture Borova, I mean, all the the Ukrainians will have to fall back. So the Russians cannot, so the Ukrainians cannot, the Russians don't have to basically fight through all these, villages here. And so, as they march downwards, they'll have a natural defense with the Oskol River on their left flank. And then everything on the right flank, the Ukrainians will have to keep breaking, and the Russians will keep taking it. And then, the Russians, the Ukrainians will fall back. And as the Russians move southwards, then everything to the north of this will be automatically broken. So, that's kind of what they did in the Liman offensive in 2022. So, it'll be kind of a repeat of that. And this week, basically, if you've been following this channel, if you've been following the updates of this war, the Russians captured Prishana early, about a month or two ago, and basically from that point they've been expanding from Prishana, growing the bridgehead here, and then slowly reaching these three villages here. So it's been a slow, this wasn't some sort of massive breakthrough. It's been a slow, steady pace coming there for the Russians, but they finally have captured these, at least have severed it in half, and, I have no doubt that they'll finish clearing these three villages and then start expanding southwards. Yeah, and so that is that is one of the biggest goals of the Russians, and now we're gonna see how they're gonna use once since they've split it. Now we're gonna see where they can continue from there, because the main goal for this obviously is to basically take everything to the on the right bank of the Oskol River. The Russians have also are battling for Petropavlovka, trying to basically they have captured the northern part of it. I think they did that last week, but they're still battling for the northern part. Um, and I would probably be guessing that they're probably going to try to capture Petropavlovka, and then probably try to liquidate these entire fields, and then kind of have the front line be a bit more closer to Kupiansk, because once that happens, they can actually start shelling Kupiansk directly with artillery. So the further they move it closer to Kupiansk, the worse would it be for the Kupiansk Ukrainian defenses. The Russians are also moving towards Vishana. We talked about this last time. A lot of sources say this village has been captured. Some say it's being contested, but in any case, I think this shows that the Russians are trying to move towards Borova, and that's where the goal is going to be. Because if the Russians keep, say they captured Vishana, maybe they move southwards, and while they do that, the Russians are moving this way, and then obviously they're going to try to attack Borova in two directions, and then obviously encircle the Ukrainians in this pocket here. So yeah. And then there's also been pushing in the Liman direction. The Russians are trying to pin the Ukrainians here, and the goal here is not necessarily to reach the Oskol River, but right now the goal is to clear everything on the other side of the Zhierbets River right here. Now, the Zhierbets River is another river that's a bit more further inwards. The Russians reached it in the north here, but it's with the captured Nevsky and Maksymilianivka. However, they still want to clear out the Ukrainian positions here, and that's what they're doing. For example, they have reached the outer outskirts of the village of Torskoye. Some Russian sources are saying they're actually battling for this village itself. We don't have exact geolocated footage yet, but it is showing that the Russians are trying to battle for this village, and the capture of it, let's say the Russians do capture Torskoye, well, then they could then move in the north here, and then kind of in tandem with the Russians moving from the Nevsky towards Novozodovka, and then these last three villages could be squeezed from two sides, and then the Russians, obviously the Russian goal is to capture everything to the right of this line. Yeah, to the east of this line. And then now the Ukrainians have a bunch of strong positions on the other side of the Zhierbets River, so I don't think the Russians are going to try to cross it. But the main goal is to basically have a more better forward position, because right now, the Russians are out in the fields. It's pretty hard to defend here. It's the natural Russian defense point is in this area. So we shall see if the the Russians will want to push the front line towards the Zhierbets River. So there's been some movement in that direction as well. There's also been some movement here. Again, they're trying to move towards Novosudovka here. They captured some fields here, and they're moving closer by close to this village right here. So yeah, lots of updates in the Kupiansk Liman direction, and the reason why I wanted to start talking about it is because of the main where they finally broke and cut the Ukrainian defenses in half. We're actually now going to talk about another area. Now, Kharkov has been quiet this week, but we're going to talk about Kursk. Kursk is another area where the Russians are making a lot of big gains. Now, we talked about how there was a big second Russian Kursk offensive, which led to the liquidation of everything of the western Ukrainian Kursk salient, and now they are liquidating everything to the north of it. So we talked about how when the Russians broke through to the village of Zelana Shilavka here, the Ukrainians had a bit of a natural defense line right here. And they were kind of trying to defend it as much as they could. However, when the Russians kind of separated it in half, and when the Russians were attacking from Snagnosk, they kind of reached the south here. And this is also a bit of a river right here, so it kind of prevents a lot of easy evacuation. So the Ukrainians were held up in Lobomovka and Trisky Luk. And so basically there was actually a massive encirclement that happened this week in these two villages, because the Ukrainians were trying to hold this as much as they could. But then with the encirclement of these with the capture of Zelana Zhilovka, and then the movement in the south here, the Ukrainians here were cut off, and basically this week the Russians have finally liquidated this pocket and captured these two villages. We had a lot of strong battles for the village of Novodinovka here, and the Russians have finally captured this village as well. The Ukrainians have been launching various counterattacks, first to try to de-blockade the Russians that were the Ukrainians that were here, but it was to no avail. And so now the Ukrainians are kind of on like this area right here. Now a lot of sources are actually saying the Russian, and what do I mean by encirclement? The Russians are trying to encircle this entire grouping of Ukrainians in this area. And this is the northern defense. And as if you once I explain to you what's happening this week, you'll understand what they're doing. So. After the capture of Novonovka here, a bunch of sources are saying the Russians made a dashing attack towards the village of Victoria right here. However, most sources say it has not been captured yet. So, the Russians are in this area, and the Ukrainians are in this area. But if the Russians could try to meet in the distance here, they could finally take the village of Victoria here, and basically, if they could capture Victoria, then they could reach the rail line here, take something like this, and then this cuts off the southern defense, the southern part of this northern salient, and then the Russians are also pushing in the north here. A lot of they're moving down along the rail line, and some sources are saying they have captured the village of Novoshorovka here, and so what's happening is that if the Russians could continue pushing southwards, and let's say they capture Victoria. Well, then, all they need to do is just basically link, basically there's just this, like, only Mala Lonovka is the main area they could leave out of for the Ukrainians. And then at that point, this entire salient will collapse. And basically the Russian goal was to have the front line go something like this. Let me span out here. So the front line will go something like this. So this entire northern salient will be taken, and then what will be left is basically what I call the southern Suchka defenses. This is where the Ukrainians are still making their last stand in Suchka. This was one of their biggest gains in the Kursk offensive, and it's one of their main achievements, and they really want to hold it. So far everything else has been, losing a bunch of villages in the west to the north. Yes, it sucks for them, but the main prize is Suchka. And they were going to hold. They have Suchka, and they have a bunch of the suburbs of it that they're trying to defend. So once this, right now the Russians are focused on liquidating the northern salient here. So this will probably take place for the next week or two, and then once this happens, then the Russians will start trying to encircle Suchka. But most of the action has been happening in the north here. However, there's also been action in the south here. A bunch of sources are saying the Russians have retaken the villages of Ruska Konovka and Cherkessky Konovka here. These were villages that the Ukrainians were trying to hold so that they could better defend Suchka from the south here. But they were not able to hold on, and the Russians have captured these two villages. There's a river, I think, what is called the Sem River, I believe. What is it called here exactly? Yeah, the Pesi River, which kind of divides, right here, and it kind of divides it in two. So, the Ukrainians are trying to use this river to hold off the Russians from trying to get to the back, right, and trying to cut off this main highway. And this is the only highway that leads to Suchka from Sumy. And so the Russians are going to be, with the capture of this area, the Russians will start using FPV drones to try to strike these areas a lot. Also, a lot of pro-Russian sources are saying they have captured the village of Pilokovka here, and but it's not been completely confirmed yet. But if that is the case, then that means the Russians have finally pushed the Ukrainians on the other side of the Pesi River, and the Russians. What I think the Russians are going to try to do here, as you can see with the movement here, is that, once they liquidate the north, they're going to probably try to start advancing to the south here, try to break the Ukrainian defenses here in Serjodonovka and Leponivka here. And then, as they try to reach, the highway from here, the Russians will then try to break through here, capture, these villages here, and then try to move to here. And then, all the Ukrainian defenses that are here will be cut off, and, or they'll have to fall back towards Sumy. So I think that once they're not going to try to advance on Suchka directly. They're gonna they're gonna probably try to focus on this area and this area to try to cut off the last line of retreat here. And I think that's what's going to be the focus for the next month or so. So yeah, that's the Kursk direction. And let us now go to the Chasov Yar and Seversk direction. Now, there's actually been a very big update in the Chasov Yar direction this week. And this week, the Russians made a big breakthrough and captured the quarry mine right here. We saw a geolocated footage of the Russians raising their flags in this area, and they were doing it in such a way that, you know, they were very calm. There was not very much chaos going on. So a lot of sources are saying, and some pro-Russian sources are also saying, that they have actually captured this quarry right here. And so basically, they have crossed the Seversky Donetsk Canal and captured, all these fields here, and they have fully captured, they probably have captured this quarry as well, because we have geolocated footage of the Russians raising their flag in these buildings right here. Anyway, at that point, we're going to see also. So this is one of the biggest goals of the Russians. Right now, they're trying to encircle Chasov Yar. They reached the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal a while ago, but now the Ukrainians are holding on in the center of Chasov Yar, and the only way they're going to force the Ukrainians out of Chasov Yar is by kicking them out from the north and south. And this breakthrough in the south is a very big deal, because this is where if the Russians have secured this, the Russians will continue advancing a bit to the south. They'll probably try to take this little quarry right here, and probably take the village of Skupchka here. And kind of have this big, try to capture this little village here. And once this happens, then the Russians could start advancing to the rear of Chasov Yar and start cutting off, the roads that lead to Chasov Yar. But again, maybe they'll capture this, take a break, and then focus in the north here. Because obviously, in order to encircle Chasov Yar, you also have to encircle it from the north here. But this breakthrough into the south, taking this quarry, advancing, in there, will give the Russians a lot of good opportunities to start putting the squeeze on Chasov Yar and finally capture this town. The Russians also made some small gains in the north here as well. The Russians have captured a little bit more of Grigorivka, having taken this part right here. They are also advancing to the south in the Kalinova forests and have captured this part here. So they're trying to battle for this forest right here. And they've advanced a little bit in the Novi district, taking this area right here. So small, steady gains. They have a small bridgehead in the Novi district. They are trying to capture, with the capture of Kalinova, they're trying to capture this forest to secure, their flank here a little bit. And then with the advance in Grigorivka, this will help them try to assault this big quarry mine from multiple directions, so that this is the main, just as the capture of the small quarry in the south was how they could encircle Chasov Yar from the south. If they could capture this, this quarry here, then that means they'll have finally started encircling Chasov Yar from the north here. So a lot of big gains in Chasov Yar, not big gains, but a lot of a big breakthrough in the south, which shows that the Russians are starting to push in Chasov Yar, and we'll see if the Ukrainians can stop them, but we shall see. And then in the Seversk direction, there's been a lot of unknowns in this direction, but we have some geolocated footage of the Russians advancing in the north here. And as I showed you in the last video, the fields to the south of Verkhomanivka and in the north of Verkhomanivka are where the high ground is. And so the capture of these high grounds are what Russia actually needs to take if they want to actually take Verkhomanivka and Bilogorivka and Grigorivka and such like that. If they want to actually capture these villages and this village, they have to capture these high rise, or not high rise, but these hills here, this high ground. And it looks like the Russians are trying to take this northern high ground here. And if they could do that, then they could actually finally secure Verkhomanivka and actually fully secure it. So a lot of unknowns in the Seversk direction. Some people are saying they're overly exaggerating. Some sources are saying it's true. So we have to. There's definitely some movement going on here. So we shall keep an eye on the Seversk direction. The Seversk direction has been kind of quiet this week. There's only been some small movements this week, specifically towards this stadium here. The Ukrainians have captured a bit more in the center part of Toretsk. They're moving along these residential areas towards this mine, and again, in this center part, there are still some high-rise buildings here, so it still takes a little while to clear them, but the Russians are slowly but surely trying to, capture this kind of stadium with a few high-rise buildings here, and are slowly but surely clearing out the residential areas. But only small gains in the Tourette's direction this week. And just a little bit more too as well. The Russians are consolidating along this rail line and river here. They are entering the southern part of Shirobrinka here. Some sources are saying they have captured this area right here. And so, so small gains here. They're consolidating here, and for a big push to try to capture these two villages here. To try to start encircling this big mine right here of Touretsk, which is what the last main defense of Touretsk for the Ukrainians. We're now going to go to the Pokrovsk direction. This is where actually a lot of the other big events are happening this week. And in the Pokrovsk direction, we actually have a lot of interesting updates. So first, we're talking about how in this northern part, this northern part has been quiet for a little bit, but now they have activated. The Russians have captured the farms in front of the village of Maksymilianivka here, and they have captured this area right here. The capture of these farms basically is a precursor to try to take this village itself, because if they could capture this village, then they'll have a good position to start firing upon, or start advancing and cutting the Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka highway. Now, there's a lot of trenches in this area, which you might not see out with a regular map. But if you look at Ukrainian defenses, then this actually shows where a bunch of trenches in this area. So it's going to be a bit harder than it looks. But with the capture of this gives the Russians a good forward position to be looking at this highway. So the Russians are finally have entered these farms, and they're probably going to start battling for this village very soon. There's been no really changes in the Pokrovsk area in the north here. I think the Russians are just consolidating here. But where the main action has been taking place, again, as usual, is in the southern part of the Pokrovsk direction in Selidova. And this week, the battle for Selidova has restarted. So the Russians entered Selidova like a month or two ago. But, about a month ago. But the Russians were not able to actually fully capture it like they did with Novy-Igorivka. And so the Russians had to basically, fall back and have to start actually bombing it and encircling it and forcing the Ukrainians out, and they are now assaulting it. So this week, the Russians made a big are starting to assault it directly. They have captured the second. Now, we talked about how this second quarry mine was actually not captured by the Russians because, we have a lot of unknowns. We never actually got a flag posted here. But now we have geolocated footage of the Russians doing an offensive operation, have captured the Touretsk mine, this kind of like these buildings that support this quarry here. And I have no doubt that the Russians are right now storming to actually finally take this second quarry here, so they could have a bit of a high ground advantage overlooking the main Ukrainian defenses, which are in the center of Selidova, guarding the high-rise building areas. So the Russians are pushing along these areas and trying to reach, right to the outskirts of the high-rise buildings area here. They're trying to put some distance here. However, not only are the Russians advancing directly, they're trying to put the squeeze on Selidova as well. And where the biggest gains are happening is in the southern direction here. So the Russians are moving along this rail line, and this week they have captured a big chunk. They have captured about this much of the southern part of Selidova, and this means that one of the main roads supplying Selidova, this road right here, has been cut physically. And the second road that leads from here and along this rail line is also towards the village of Vishana is about to be cut. Some sources are saying the Russians are already battling for this village right here, and this will be a very bad news for the Ukrainians. But right now, I think the Ukrainians are still in control of this village, but the Russians are getting very, very close. If the Russians could continue advancing along this rail line and, take the village of Vishana, and, say the front line goes something like this, then they'll have only one way to support themselves, which is going through this road right here. And then from that point, the Russians could advance, the Russians have been advancing along this highway and trying to reach and cut this area right here. So, the Ukraine's going to have to put a bunch of troops defending, this northern sector because, the Russians, I think it's almost a foregone conclusion that the Russians will take Vishana. However, the Russians still have a little bit ways to go to cut off physically this highway. And so, The Ukrainians are probably putting a bunch of troops on these tree lines, and that's why they're putting such a big defense in Sujka Yar and Lishtivka, because they don't want the Russians to be able to continue pushing from the north and encircle Selidova entirely. So the assault of Selidova is ongoing. It is bloody, and we shall see if the Russians continue putting the squeeze on it, but I will probably see Selidova fall by the end of November or so. There's actually been not much changes in the north part here, where the Russians have been trying to do another encirclement of Gernik and Karovka-Kivka. I think the Russians took Tuskurna here, but they have not been able to break through the Ukrainian defenses in the north here. So far, even though the southern defenses have been cut off, the Ukrainians still have positions to supply the troops in Gernik and Karovka-Kivka here. So we shall see how if the Russians want to renew their advances here, or if the Ukrainians continue holding on such strong defenses. Also, the Russians are continuously clearing the Nevsky pocket. They have captured more fields to the other side of the Vochka River, and I think the Russians are just gonna kind of capture, sit here, and then because I don't think they're going to attack Gernik and Kharkivka directly. I think they're going to stop here and then just wait until the Russians try to break through here somehow and encircle the Ukrainians here. Now, one of the biggest gains that the Russians have finally taken this week is the fall of Maksymilianivka right here. We have geolocated footage of the Russians, raising their flags, putting, the units come together like, hey, we've liberated Maksymilianivka. So we have a very basically they captured Maksymilianivka, and this was a foregone conclusion, because once they captured Ostrovka and Hostra, and basically reached this area right here, the Ukrainians will basically had to fall back, because they were going to attack from the east and then from the north here. And basically with this push, the Russians basically have captured Maksymilianivka, and not only that, they have actually captured the field to the south of it to secure their gains a little bit better here. So they're doing a very good job capturing Maksymilianivka, and to be honest, I don't think they're going to continue advancing towards Karakova very much. I don't think they're going to try to attack it directly, because the Ukrainians have very strong defenses here, because they've been expecting the Russians to come from this area, because, obviously, the Russians were battling for Marninka for a long time. They then battled for Grigukva in the first half of this year. Then they battled for Maksymilianivka for the last half of this year. So they've been expecting the Russians to reach Karakova for a while now, and so the Russians pretty much just have to hold their positions in this area, and just kind of hold something like this, and then and then they'll just wait until the Russians from the north here reach the northern bank here, and then encircle the Ukrainians here, and then liquidate this pocket, and then from here the Russians could start moving to the west here and start trying to encircle Karakova, trying to reach something like this, right? And then try to cut off Karakova from this area. And then at that point, they could start encircling Karakova, and the battle for that city could begin in earnest. But I don't think they're going to attack it directly without first trying to deal with the Ukrainians here. But yeah, very big gains in Maksymilianivka. Capture this is a good gain for the Russians. And so a lot of success in the south here, but not so much success in the north here, as they try to advance and encircle the Ukrainians here. In the South Donetsk, Ugledar direction, there's been some gains here as well. A lot of sources are saying the Russians have captured the village of Katerinivka here. We actually have some geolocated footage of the Russians being in the eastern part of it, but most sources are saying that they are already battling for the center part, and some pro-Russian sources are saying that the village is basically already captured. They're just doing clearing operations, which makes sense. The Ukrainians will have a good position in Yasenivka here with this water reservoir, which will give them a good position from being attacked directly. So the Russians will have to attack it from these fields here, which are a lot harder. But Katerinivka, the battle for this village, is now happening in earnest in it. So the Russians are pushing through here. Once they capture Katerinivka, they'll probably try to cross this area right here and try to take Antonovka and take these two villages. And with the capture of these two villages, this will give them a good position with the flanks to start attacking towards Bogdanovka here. And which is the main goal of the Russians. There's been some small gains to the north of Ugledar. They have actually finally captured one of these small shaft strongholds. They've captured this stronghold right here. So small gains. The Russians are slowly but surely moving northwards, and but the Ukrainians are putting some fierce resistance in Bogdanovka. So the push north towards Ugledar is slow but sure. The Russians have improved their position. They captured Zoltanovka last week. They've improved their positions a little bit and captured a few fields to the west of it. Probably just to have a continuous good front line between Zoltanovka and Novodonetska for any sort of, and have capture this main road that helps supply, so the Russians don't have to go all the way around. So it was basically trying to secure this road here between Novodonetska and Zoltanovka and have a better line defense from Ukrainians if they want to attack them from Velika Novosolovka. So some small gains in the Ugledar direction. And now let's go to the Zaporozhye direction here. In this area, so in this area, a lot of sources are saying that this will be where the Russians do their offensive. We don't know yet. I don't have a magic ball. I don't have any inside sources, but this is what a lot of people are saying. We talked about how they captured Ladonna last week, and they have actually continued their offensive and have captured something like they've kind of reached these ravines right here. And a lot of sources are saying they're trying to now move towards Novodarivka here. So, they captured Ladinovka, are now have captured a few fields to the north of it to expand their positions there. So there's been some small movements, but a lot of sources are saying that this area in like Velika Novosolovka and Galiapolia, this area right here is where the Russians plan on doing a big offensive push. So we shall see if that is true or not. And yeah, no changes in the Kherson direction, and no real changes in the Zaporozhye direction as well. Zaporozhye is kind of this area as well, but no changes in like the Orekha Robotina area. So that's the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed my update for this week. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel if I'm going to continue receiving these weekly Russian Ukrainian War updates. Comment your thoughts and share this video around. So aim high and wonder on.